Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt is by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the basically challenge of voice acting long games. It's not basically a challenge, it's a huge challenge. And today, Lordrusty asks, is voice acting the worst thing to happen to RPG video games? I've recently been playing Gene Forge, a nostalgic favorite of mine. I can't help noticing the writing is just better than its more modern RPG titles. I find a similar trend whenever I play most older RPGs. I still come back to Morrowind for its story and writing, but I can't say I've done the same for Oblivion or Skyrim. It's possible there's a selection bias in play here, only the ones with good writing get remembered, but I think the main phenomena at play is that these games didn't have to limit the amount of writing to what could be voice acted, so could go more in depth, and also the writing was a greater focus, as designers couldn't use actors' performances as a crutch. I think it's not a coincidence that Disco Elysium is widely acclaimed for its writing and was released with only partial voice acting. There's now a trend to take these older games, particularly partially voiced titles such as Morrowind, and use tools such as OpenAI to give voice acting to these characters. We've also seen indie games such as Spaceborne 2 use AI to voice act all of the lines in their game to keep costs low. Provided voice actors were properly compensated for their likeness rights, and with the actor strikes ongoing, that's up in the air, is the future of great RPG writing to have an actor voice the pivotal scenes for a character, as well as some template dialogue, and then fill out the rest of their dialogue with AI mimicking the actor, giving us the best of both worlds, where characters sound like human beings, but writers can write reams and reams of interactive dialogue options without having someone in the recording booth for hundreds of hours. Well, I think that is the future of those types of games. But of course, we're going to talk about, basically everything except that. Yes, but, and now there's 30 minutes. Yeah, so obviously the first thing, the elephant in the room, would be the sort of ethics question with deep learning or artificial intelligence generated art. I think that this issue is often kind of shut down by the idea that it's just bad, and in fact it's still worth talking about, even though we can all agree that it would be good if artists were paid to do their work, if they won't do it or be able to do it without being paid. A snarky response of mine would be, what would be good would be if you didn't have to have a way where the thing you were doing had to be contrived into being worth money. We could all just agree it was worthwhile, and you could just do that. And to some extent, I think that you can contrive a way that the thing you're doing is worth money, if it's worthwhile. But a lot of people either don't have that option, or I would say from my own experience, there's a lot of privilege, and it just takes a lot of time to get a platform to be successful. So you can't just say there is a valid market for me to market my art. But I only realize that once I have college debt and, I'm working a 9-to-5 job, and I can't just eat the logistical cost of making a YouTube channel about my artwork or something every day. And so even though it's technically possible that if I had seen this from the beginning, or our education system had told me I could do this, I could make a living making my art, and it's okay if AI displaces traditional art jobs. Even though technically that could be possible, it just isn't practical. Yes, that's true. If we lived in a utopia where you didn't need to make money, et cetera, et cetera. So you might say, well, it's pedantic to act like, oh, it's good for there to be AI art. It's just that the inevitable consequence of there being AI art is bad. Isn't that distinction meaningless? I just think maybe it isn't. This is a good example of a more practical application. There are cases where it could create jobs where they would hire no voice actor, but if it's possible to hire a voice actor but still get the amount of stuff they want recorded, maybe they would consider hiring a voice actor for that game where they wouldn't have before. I think that type of argument is a little dangerous. I think sometimes it's easy to handwave the idea that it would create new jobs, when in fact games will seek the cheapest route, which would be to use an AI for the whole thing, not to use a human for none of it. But I don't know. I'm also pretty skeptical that using a human for part of it will make it meaningfully better for very long, or like that a very skilled editor couldn't make it like about as good as a human could make it. Imagine you get a good actor and they say a line, but then over here there's a guy with a deep learning algorithm who spits out 100 takes of that line, trained on a bunch of people that were not paid for the training done on the content they made. Yes, that's bad, but anyway. And then the editor person selects of those 100 takes one or a few to kind of splice together to make a thing. I feel like you would get about as good of a result from doing that. It's difficult for me to believe that it would be so impossible to kind of challenge acting that way. I think editing is very powerful. Though maybe people don't do that much. I don't know. Will people start doing that more? Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the possibilities for things that really weren't possible otherwise, but then the deep learning algorithm generative AI makes it possible for them to exist. I think that's an exciting topic. I am a little skeptical of the idea that it will end up being good for anyone in those industries, even though it definitely could be. I think the variety question is pretty up in the air. Like, if it's really important for those systems to get a lot of art. An interesting suggestion I've heard is that you could have like a very focused algorithm that was trained on like a bunch of things from a very specific artist group, and they're making all the profit off of that. And so you can kind of subscribe to their type of art or style and get things from that style. But we're pretty far away from a situation where that would be the case. So yeah, there are a lot of problems, but I think it's not a bad thought that, you know, you could use voice acting as kind of a seed, and then the AI could fill out like the totally insane amount of content afterward. Now, we're not going to spend the whole time talking about deep learning algorithms. I know that you don't want that because there's plenty of other stuff in this in this parlay. And we are going to talk about that, but I thought it was worth addressing the sort of elephant in the room topic first. It is a topic there's stuff to say about. Like, I don't clearly agree or disagree personally. I feel like that's not a bad point, but I also have a lot of concerns. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think you're right that that will be a thing people will try. I'm not sure I feel like that will be the bulk of what's included. Let's take this from a kind of a different direction. So earlier in the parlay, you made a claim that I thought was a really interesting way to think about these titles. So you said, I think the main phenomenon at play here is that these games didn't have to limit the amount of writing to what could be voice acted. So they could go more in depth, and also the writing was a greater focus. Designers couldn't use actors' performances as a crutch. A big question I've often had when playing games like that is where the limits were. You know, sometimes I play a game and there's like weirdly little variety in an area where I feel like it's like objectively quite easy to generate variety. An example would be like a shopkeeper has the exact same voice line every time you speak with them. But then some other area of the game has a ton of variety, but that type of variety is much more difficult to generate. Like, the game has seemingly endless but not procedurally generated backgrounds, which would take a very long time. My cousin made a game like this. She made the backgrounds, and I saw so much work and all the different backgrounds she made. And playing that game, that left a real impression. But then other parts of the game were weirdly thin in a way that made me feel like, wait, you could match the variety of the backgrounds that my cousin spent like 4 months making by having one guy spend like just one night writing dialogue options for this, or, you know, dialogue lines for this NPC. Was that really not worth it at any point? You know, like, I didn't fully understand why that. I don't think backgrounds are especially important to this. I mean, they are important, but not more important than literally all other variety. I don't know. That's weird. I don't know why that happened. This topic has always bothered me. Like, I definitely don't understand, not having made enough games myself, why those resource decisions are being made. There are lots of times when I play a game where I see monumental amounts of effort put into one place, but then some other part of the game that would take a like trivially small amount of time to fix is just left there. And you can only think that it's just because they simply don't have someone whose job it is to do that, because it could not possibly take them like longer than this other part of the game that's getting so much attention. So I think that you're right that it's an investment thing. Like, they're not changing it on the fly. They're choosing to set up a lot of writing or whatever because there's no other limit where that will feel kind of mismatched. Or if they're going to voice the whole game, I don't know. I wonder if games don't like the look of, oh, we're partially voice acted, but then it just kind of goes away. I have to say, I think Disco Elysium did a good job of that, personally. It doesn't leave much of an impression on me that the original release of the game didn't have full voice acting, though I think it's pretty interesting that when they updated it, they did release full voice acting for the whole game. That, you know what I mean? Like, they very unambiguously wanted that, but just couldn't, and so they chose, you know, to do what they could and have it leave an impression, and then they got to voice act the rest. That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think in Disco Elysium it's also hard because that's a game that really draws out this point you made about being able to just write a ton of dialogue. Quick Disco Elysium flyby if you haven't played this game. This isn't a spoiler. This is one of the kind of structure elements of the game. So the game will give you different dialogue options, or, you know, you can pick certain personality traits, stats. But Disco Elysium doesn't treat these as things you're better or worse at necessarily. They're things that you're more biased toward. So if you have higher, you know, visual calculus, then you kind of notice patterns in the environment more easily. Whereas if you have more motorics, well, that's like a reflex area of stats and intuition and stuff like that as well, if I remember correctly. Esprit de corps would be like you're more biased to think about police culture. So when things come up that could be construed as a police culture detail, a voice will chime in that like is the part of your mind thinking from the perspective of the police. That might not be correct or good, but that part of the story is kind of added to the narrative. What I'm trying to say is there is an awful lot of dialogue to voice that like isn't in most people's playthroughs. You know what I mean? That it is a shockingly resource intensive way to make a game if you were going to voice act it, because even per unit of story, having that mechanic means it's going to take so much more work to voice act what seems like a paragraph, because it's not a paragraph. It's like 4 paragraphs, and the player sees like a third to a half of them, you know, at any given time. Probably less than that, more like a quarter. Anyway, you get the idea, right? It's a mechanic that shows a flagrant disregard for the resources because it's cool. It's a cool idea. And so, yeah, hell yeah, they're going to make that, right? But as you say, Lordrusty, it would be weird to not acknowledge that that would take a lot of effort to voice act. And maybe they wouldn't have done that if they felt like that was the thing they needed to do. I don't know. I do want to briefly mention something that kind of bothers me in these conversations, which is this idea that the primary motivation for doing something in the game would be something other than it is a good thing to do in the game. Like, these discussions frequently talk about the practical nature of making the game because, like, in practice, you have limited money, and so you have to, you know, do the voice acting budget the way that there's a certain amount of money for that, right? But sometimes it frustrates me a little bit. The discussion about these things almost immediately stops being about whether it's good to make the game be that way, and is almost entirely about whether you just like can, with investment money, make the game that way. You know what I mean? To be incredibly brash, I feel like there's an element where I'm tempted to say, okay, but if that's a good thing to do and you really set your mind to it, you could find people you could rope into doing it with you to like make the game have that voice acting. Like you're telling me if I hold a gun to your head and say, find someone in your life you can influence to join you on this adventure and make the life-changing piece of art. I'm not saying that that's how people should do it. Goodness, no. I'm just trying to say I do think it's to be acknowledged that Disco Elysium is not a game that had like all the money, and it was made by a smallish team. And of course they probably I don't know, they probably hired people. But my point is, I think they made it that way because they were passionate about making it that way, not because it was a good use of resources. It was an extremely aggressive use of resources, but they were just convinced that was a good way to do it. And I think that that shouldn't be overlooked. I'm not trying to say the practicality doesn't matter or that people shouldn't be paid to voice act it. I'm not saying that at all. But I think it's worth acknowledging that to some extent, this entire subject just doesn't matter because when people really want to make it, they make it that way. Like and at great expense. If you know anything about Disco Elysium's development, you know that's the other side of this subject, at great personal expense. That's not to be overlooked, but I think it should still be acknowledged that the main factor is not necessarily always logistical. You know, how much money is it to do? How voice acting intensive is it to do? There is an element where some people will override that and say, but it's so good, we're gonna do it the way you can do it. I'm not surprised to hear that there, like Disco Elysium, there are a number of games that were made by a smaller, very intensely involved team. Yes, I'm more biased toward thinking that smaller teams are more passionate. Sure, that's a bias I'm admitting. And then those games would later go on to kind of add full voice acting. Or it sounded like you were saying, Lordrusty, that some games like Morrowind, which were partially voiced, maybe using the existing voice acting as seed for a deep learning algorithm to generate the rest of the voicing. Is that the idea? That's interesting. Like, rather than just generating the rest of the voicing using a similar voice, obviously they're going to match the voices using what's in the game, but they like trained the speaking patterns off of that, maybe? I don't know. That's interesting. I guess that's the same thing, isn't it? Anyway, what I would now like to talk about, just as I'm looking over the parlay, Lordrusty, you included this little side thing. There's a little thread on the side. And Lordrusty says, for context, I'm aware I am this guy. I'm not afraid of games which are a little dry and that might color my experience here. Lordrusty has attached an image of a bunch of menus being opened that says, I didn't notice the image before, so I'm sorry for not including it. It's like a bunch of menus being opened, like in Windows, you know, you have a menu and then a menu nested in the menu. And the caption is, turn-based RPG fans be like, damn, this battle's getting intense. Rusty is trying to suggest that maybe they are a player that really enjoys like very, very dry, by some people's standards, pieces of media. So reading the beginning of the parlay again, you might understand what maybe Lordrusty means. You said, the games didn't have to limit the amount of writing that to what could be voice acted, and so could go more in depth, and also the writing was a greater focus. Now, if you think about that and think about which games are being referred to here, this is the game with like a ton of text everywhere, and the game has 50 books that are inside of the game that only exist in the world of the game, and there is a lot of reading like a book, but in the game interface involved in the game. Yeah, I would agree that there's a stereotype that those games are a bit dry. Sure, I understand that. I'll be honest that I have my own stereotype as somebody deep into the English department of their university, that the in-game writing is usually not that good. Or honestly, I think a lot of writing is not that good. People are, especially some of my background in poetry, I think people are real cheap in terms of being impressed by writing. Usually writing finds people where the venue makes it easier to sell the writing as being like pretty good. And I think writing is one of those mountains where you get to a peak and then you look up and you're like, wow, I'm very far away from being actually good at writing. Certainly I've felt that way myself. Writing has an enormous range. You know, I feel like there's some extremely unimaginably bad writing by people that it's kind of shocking that they can't do better. Many people I've known for a good amount of my young life that are, you know, natively English speaking people that were taught the same, I think pretty good all in all, like English and grammar courses I was, and had to write a bunch of essays, yet can barely write sentences that like flow together at all. And then there are people that can easily write a book that people will buy. But when you get into what's going on in this book, I mean, it's a coherent story. But I mean, if you have an editor and you can write coherent English, then I mean, there you go. There's not much art to it. People are easily impressed by a story that is something they want at that time. So I don't know. I think the what is good writing thing is tricky. It's hard, I think, to write things that feel like they're from a world that isn't yours, I guess. A lot of writing relies heavily on, you know, where the person is from. There's this saying that has come up in another parlay about how all writing is autobiographical, which I've always really hated that phrase, but the idea is perfectly sound. A lot of writing has a lot of artifacts from, you know, who wrote it. It feels like it's from this world or a kind of response to things in the world we live in. Or you can kind of draw connections like that. And my point is that I think if you're going to write good writing that's in a fictional world, trying to make it so it doesn't feel like that is something that would add value. It would make it feel better. And that's extremely hard. Like, I don't know how you would do that. Basically, just more writing. You needed to reference things in the world. But then that makes it oblique and impossible to understand. But it is oblique and impossible to understand, so I guess that's what people do. Sure, I don't really like tons of wordiness in games. I think that another aspect of this discussion about having games that are really righty, that isn't anything you included, Lordrusty, is that the competition for people's attention has become, and I'm going to add something that might seem a little controversial here, rightly more competitive nowadays. A lot of people talk about how people have like worse attention spans nowadays, but I think to some extent people had absurdly unlimited attention spans way back when. People were willing to give things that didn't get to the point kind of the time of day for free because that's all that was there. A lot of games got replayed a lot because they were the only game available. That was just the game you had. And so people kind of got through what was like hard to defend types of game design because that was just what they had. You know, that doesn't mean the game was good. That means they were trapped, I guess. I'm not trying to say that you, Lordrusty, are trapped with these games that you've played and enjoyed. I absolutely believe that you really did enjoy them. I myself have enjoyed reading through a readerly game now and then. I played Disco Elysium before it was fully voiced, and I enjoyed reading the hell out of I played basically damn near everything that is in that game. I played so much of that game's content. I really, really enjoyed it. I played it multiple times, and I read the absolute bejesus out of everything that I could put my eyes on. I'm absolutely not a person who like won't take the time for that kind of thing. I'm a person who's spent a significant time in my life writing and reading. I read books. I know, novel nowadays. Not a ton, but it's a thing that I'm willing to do. So I'm absolutely not misunderstanding the appeal. That is something that you can enjoy for sure. At the same time, I do think it's not totally unjustified that people are kind of not willing to invest their time in these things nowadays. Honestly, I feel like of the many things, the walls of text that have recently been put in front of my eyes, besides Parley, which is almost always worth reading through, honestly, I feel like Parley is one of the most content-dense things I read nowadays. I frequently see pop-up text in Genshin Impact, for example, and I think it's just not rewarding enough to spend the time reading through it. There's not enough value added to the gameplay experience. And the game's kind of pace doesn't quite match it either. A lot of games are, this is kind of the same issue, I guess, but are designed in such a way where the game is quite fast-paced, and so to dead stop everything and the player sees text on the screen to read, a lot of people are just going to click through it so they can go, go, go. And I don't think that that's unfair or because people have no attention spans. I feel like the game told them that was what the experience was going to be like. So I guess that's not necessarily a knock against the writing, but I do think the writing isn't as good. I don't necessarily disagree with you that the writing is worse in a lot of these games. But I do also think that the lack of emphasis is because of a correct value shift away from things that take a ton of the player's time and don't have a clear payoff. When I say correct, I just mean justified, I guess, but not just justified. Like, I think that we're closer to what you would actually expect most people, given free choice, would prefer. I don't think most humans have or will ever preferred to take that much time with things, and I think that's okay. That doesn't mean that it's bad for them to exist for people that like them. I'm just suggesting that maybe the focus on games without as much dialogue is because of a correctly identified, that's what I was trying to say with the whole correct versus rightly thing. A correctly identified trend that people understand they don't want something that slow now. And I think that's okay, but kind of sad still. It's cool to get games that have just tons of lore available in them. It's cool to have played games where there are whole books in the game that are not bad books, like genuinely okay books. That's wonderful, you know, like that's cool. And I don't know, I mean, I think writing is one of those things where you can theoretically add a lot of value to the game for rather little cost. I think it's awesome to see games like Hades that have so much dialogue. I have played maybe 400 or 500 runs in Hades, and I've only barely seen like almost all of the game's dialogue. That's insane. Do you know how much time that is? How much time is that? Hold on. 500 hours or so? That's preposterous. Like, a lot of that is literally just Darren Korb in the sound booth. That guy's crazy. Being able to add stuff like that, even if it isn't voiced, is definitely a way you can add a lot of stuff to a game without that many other people's help. And I have the heretical view that getting a lot of other people involved in your game development is principally bad. You just have to most of the time. It's extremely difficult to make, you know, most games concepts alone, but it would be good if you could. That is not a common opinion on the subject, but it is my opinion on the subject. I think for a lot of people, the game's vision is lopsided, like it's not evened out by having a lot of different people working on it. So if it's going to be lopsided anyway, I would rather just have your individual vision. Now, what I would rather have is a game vision that isn't lopsided. But if it's going to be warped around a few people's perspectives anyway, I would rather just have it be your perspective, and I can see that, rather than some bespoke combination of perspectives, but it still isn't well balanced. The game's priorities still don't make sense. They're still not good, but they're not even one person's priorities. That doesn't seem good to me. I mean, I have a strong bias. I think that most games made by, almost all games made by large teams of people are almost automatically bad in any way other than presentation. I can't think of very many experiences I thought were good compared to the competition, let's say it that way, except in how they looked. And a lot of them, even for all those resources, are still not reliably, you know, pitch perfect on the presentation. I just don't think that a game with good graphics is necessarily better than a game that doesn't have good graphics, but besides that, essentially the elements of the presentation are like as good or better because they were united under a person's vision. I don't know, this is all talk until I've done it myself, right? I definitely want the perspective of having gone through that myself, and then I can comment more on, well, yeah, but at the same time, but all things being equal, I don't know. I mean, you know, you play D&D, you're sitting down at your tabletop role-playing game table, and your dungeon master, you know, does all the voices and stuff. I think having it be that you can do all the things, you know, I'm not good at voice acting. So imagine I make a game, and I voice act all of it. Now, the voice acting, well, it's not good, but if I write more in the game, it is voice acted. I mean, we don't have to limit it based on that. All in all, I might prefer that. Then again, I have played games where the voice acting was so bad that I turned off the game's audio. And I liked the rest of the game a lot. So Maybe I don't agree with that perspective, but you could turn it off. You could let the player turn it off. I don't know. I don't know. That's my opinion. I have a strong opinion about this. I think it's not so bad to go hard for the more multimedia approach. And if it's really, I don't know, a lot of games that try to have good voice acting don't. So maybe people could just go for it. And if it's terrible, I don't know. Maybe I'm going to make a game like this. You just voice act it yourself, even though I just blatantly can't do many of those voices. I feel like that wouldn't be that bad. I don't know. Again, it's like in the worst case, you could just turn it off. And if you're willing to do it off the cuff, let me put it this way. What if you had a game with a huge amount of dialogue, and the person who wrote the dialogue would, let's not say voice act, but would read, because it would barely be voice acting anyway, would read the dialogue. Voice acting, it's easy to say, like, you just voice the lines. Like, actual voice acting is very hard. Like, you can't just, like, drop everything and voice act, you know, all the stuff. I don't want that to sound hand-wavy. I'm fully aware that would be very bad. But I'm just thinking out loud, like, would I really rather not have a feature where someone just read all the dialogue and then you could just turn it off? I don't know. And I think that would add a lot of value. I wanted to end with an anecdote. I kind of like some parts of the story in Arknights, but they have a presentation issue. It's bad in a kind of interesting way. So the game would originally be in Chinese characters. When they ported it to English, they didn't account specifically for the timing change between converting the Chinese words to English. They just assigned each Chinese character a certain amount of time before the dialogue advances. So the dialogue appears on the screen, and if you hit the auto version, it's meant to advance at a speed that you can set to be like a speed that people normally read at, or like at least a regular speed. You know, you should be able to adjust the speed so that it advances at a time that is like equal to the amount of text on the screen, and then you can speed it up or slow it down, right? But they didn't do that. They just said it so each character in Chinese worth of dialogue converted, you know, it's like half a second, let's say, before it advances. It's not, it would be way less than that, but you get the idea. Because of the standard timing, the longer the sentence is, or the longer that chunk of dialogue is, the more the timing is off. So if the lines are short, the timing settings work well, but they're not usually short. They're usually pretty long. And that means that the timing is always wrong. All the settings are always a little off for everyone. There's like not really a possible reading speed where your reading lags as you read. That would be what it would have to be. For longer chunks of dialogue, the time between moving forward to the next dialogue is like 10 times longer, which is really bad because they didn't manually set the time to advance every time. Again, going back to my resource thing, it's very difficult to imagine that it wasn't like possible and advisable to have one person for like one day just go through and like hit a button when they thought the timing like should be. I feel like that wouldn't take very long for a game that makes that amount of money, but whatever. And so recently I've taken to reading the story using a website that has all of the dialogue, all of the character sprites, and you can click them to see them bigger, the backgrounds, and then if there are little sound effects, there's a button where you can click to play the sound effect at the time it should play. And even though that experience is pretty hodgepodge, it's a lot better than the in-game experience and has made me interested in reading the dialogue again. So what I do is I skip through all of it during playing the story before maybe like the final boss or something, because I'm going to end up getting spoiled on who that'll be. And then I read through it on this website for, you know, it's like, it'll be like maybe a half-hour read. And then I, you know, play the end of the story chapter. And it's pretty all right, like not a bad experience. Fake Grand Order is a game that I don't think has a better story, really, but it does have better automatic scrolling dialogue, and that quality of life increase is more than enough for me to feel like that's a better experience in-game. I guess the reason I wanted to add this at the end is that I didn't really get into it in the main chunk, but if you're not going to have fully voiced dialogue, I think there's quite a lot that can be done to make the presentation more fun for the player. Another thing that Arknights does that I really like in principle is when you go to skip dialogue, it does give you a very brief, like 1 or 2 sentence summary of more or less what happens. So if you're interested in the dialogue, but you're skipping through it anyway because it sucks the way they present it, then you can still hit the button and like, I'm not disinterested in what's going on. Like, I mean, it only takes 1 second for them to pop that up anyway, big deal. And then you can follow along vaguely, and maybe you're interested in the events throughout, and you can just stop and listen to them if you want, or go to this website. I think that's a great feature that helps a lot. It's okay if after hundreds of hours of dialogue that you added into your game, because it doesn't have voice acting and you can do that, you know, the player doesn't always want to sit through all of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested. I mean, they are still playing your game after all. Though again, these games have a lot, well, not Fate Grand Order, but Arknights has a lot of gameplay that isn't dialogue related. But you get the point. I do think it's worthwhile to include that type of thing. If the player is interested, I think it's fine to let them be interested the way they're interested. And things like auto-scrolling, maybe let the player set the speed. That could be an interesting solution. The player hits a test mode, and then they read, and then they say when they're done, and the game records that as like their average reading speed or so. Something like that. I don't know. Anyway, and then some kind of summary feature, or like a skip, but you still give the player the option to have like a very high-level summary of what's going on. I don't know. I think that's a good idea. I think it's worth suggesting that, to go back to my argument about people are, you know, understandably, maybe this is the people's ground state, not as interested in wading through it, just reading a ton of dialogue. Yeah, okay, but maybe it would help to innovate on the presentation too. You can have just dialogue without voice acting and have it be interesting to people, maybe but just by helping them be interested in it. I think that's okay. You know, I don't think it's wrong of people to want a promise of value or entertainment when they consume this stuff. The problem is just that there isn't really a clear win here. You either make a game that's marketed as being a more multimedia experience, or a game with a ton of writing, when in fact I think I would like more innovation for the writing focused games. Don't give up and try to market a different way. It's just writing, but you're doing a lot of work to make it fun for the player, or present it to the player in an interesting way. That appeals to me a lot. I don't know, like there could be more you could do, like when the player does the reading is also interesting, or maybe there's something happening in the game world, like you're on a ride, or like a, you know, you're traveling in some way, and that is when you read. Letting the player kind of plan around, you know, they just find a block of text all of a sudden and they read. I don't know, but maybe if there's a better timing for when they're reading those things, maybe, I don't know. It reminds me a little bit of tutorializing, where if you can time the tutorial better, it can make a tutorial suddenly better all by itself. You didn't actually change anything. You just delivered the tutorial at a more desirable time, like when the player has a certain rhythm for their attention. I don't think that's bad. You know, if you think this is, maybe not Lordrusty, but if anybody hears that and thinks, well, that's just holding people's hands too much, like why can't people just be interested in reading things? Sure, but I mean, if you want that, then why is it bad to help people be interested in that? I don't know. I think it's fair, maybe for like younger folks nowadays too. You should get to be shown what is supposed to be fun about reading a book. You don't just have to blindly accept from me saying that it's entertaining to read a book. You know, it's okay to want some demonstration of why that would be good before arbitrarily assigning your attention to it. That's okay. I don't think it's bad to want that. But I guess not every game has to do that. I just think it's an interesting subject. It's definitely a thing you can do. Again, structuring a game that way, I feel like is more the real solution, but the summary thing and the skip thing and the scrolling speed thing, all things that I think are meaningful. I think that's all I have to say. This was a cool topic.